The fluorescent hum of the office lights was a familiar thrum against Reid's temples, a constant, low-grade irritation that had become the soundtrack to his life. Another Tuesday, another spreadsheet. His world was a predictable grid of numbers and deadlines, neatly categorized and filed away. He was good at it, this meticulous cataloging of data, but the satisfaction was thin, like tracing the outline of a meal rather than tasting it. He often found himself staring out the window, past the dull sheen of the city's glass towers, imagining a different kind of quiet, a silence not punctuated by keyboard clicks and muted phone calls. The call came mid-morning, shattering the rhythmic tap-tap of his colleague's mechanical keyboard. It wasn't his usual contact. The voice on the other end, formal and clipped, introduced herself as an executor. Reid barely registered the name of the deceased, a distant relative he'd met perhaps twice in his life, decades ago, at some forgotten family gathering. The news of the death itself was unsettlingly abrupt, sudden and without clear cause, the voice stated carefully, a phrase that hung in the air, hinting at an ellipsis. But it was the next part that truly dislodged Reid from his carefully constructed routine, an inheritance. A cabin. Deep in the woods. He remembered the relative vaguely, a stoic figure, always with a faraway look in their eyes. There had been whispers, hushed tones at those gatherings, about the old place and strange goings-on. Reid had dismissed them then as rural eccentricity, the kind of superstitious nonsense that clung to isolated communities. Now, the memory prickled at him, an unexpected thorn. The legal documents arrived a week later, thick cream envelopes holding maps and deeds, all detailing a property so remote it seemed to exist on the very edge of cartography. It was an ancient cabin, nestled within a forgotten forest, miles from the nearest paved road. The instructions were precise, almost demanding, urging his immediate presence. A strange urgency permeated the stiff paper, an unspoken pressure that made the hairs on his arms rise. Reid told his manager he needed time off, a personal matter. He packed lightly, throwing in essentials, a headlamp, sturdy boots, a compass, practical items for a place described as off-grid. He felt a strange pull, a reluctant curiosity mixed with a growing apprehension. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shedding its urban sprawl for rolling hills, then denser woodlands. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track that narrowed into little more than 2 ruts carved through overgrown grass. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of ancient trees, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. He passed an old weather station, its metal tower a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, an abandoned sentinel standing guard over the encroaching wilderness. The instruments were rusted, some broken, wires dangling like severed nerves. The track ended abruptly at a clearing. Before him stood the cabin. It wasn't merely old, it felt ancient, as if it had grown from the very soil, roots twisting deep into the earth. A faint, acrid smell, like damp earth mixed with something metallic and vaguely sweet, hung in the air. The forest pressed in from all sides, a dense, watchful presence. He clenched his jaw, determined not to let the atmosphere overwhelm him. He had come this far. He needed answers about this place, about the relative he barely knew, and about the strange legacy he had unexpectedly inherited. Another Tuesday, another spreadsheet. He had stared at the email for a full minute, the subject line, estate of, relative's name, a jarring interruption in the orderly flow. A distant relative he'd met once, perhaps twice, at funerals. Now, the cabin was his. The drive had been a pilgrimage into an ever-deepening green. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to a pair of muddy ruts that clawed their way through a dense, primeval forest. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, dappling the path in shifting, moss-colored light. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of loam and decaying leaves. When the cabin finally emerged from the gloom, it was less a dwelling and more an organic outgrowth of the landscape, its dark timber walls almost swallowed by clinging vines. Reid pushed open the front door. The groan of ancient hinges was a complaint. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of dust, aged wood, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old pennies, mixed with a dry, herbal scent he couldn't quite place. He dropped his duffel bag onto the rough-hewn floorboards, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. For the first few days, Reid attributed every creak and groan to the cabin's age. He spent his time methodically cleaning, sweeping away decades of accumulated dust, airing out the musty rooms. He found a rusty old shovel and dug a rough trench around the perimeter, diverting rainwater, trying to impose some order on the encroaching wildness. He was a man of logic, of practical solutions. An old house made noises. That was simply how it was. Yet, there were moments. He'd turn, expecting to see a branch swaying outside, but the boughs would be still. He blamed the isolation, the unfamiliar quiet after years of city bustle. His mind was playing tricks. One afternoon, after a long session clearing out the cramped pantry, Reid went to retrieve his multi-tool from the kitchen counter. He was certain he had left it next to the chipped ceramic sink. It wasn't there. He searched the entire kitchen, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, he found it resting on the mantelpiece in the living room, a room he hadn't entered since first dropping his bags. He paused, staring at the tool. Had he put it there? Could he have been so absent-minded? He shook his head, a dismissive huff escaping his lips. He was tired. The true event occurred 2 nights later. A storm had rolled in, lashing rain against the windows and sending the wind into a frenzied howl. Reid had lit a few oil lamps, preferring their soft glow to the unreliable generator he'd managed to coax into sputtering life. He was reading, a tattered novel he'd brought with him, when a distinct thump reverberated from the attic directly above his head. It wasn't the wind, not a branch, but a heavy, deliberate sound, like something large being dropped. He froze, his breath catching. He listened, straining against the storm's fury. Then, a low, guttural moan seemed to ripple through the floorboards beneath him. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but undeniably present. It held a profound sorrow, a deep, ancient ache. Reid's grip tightened on the book, his knuckles white. He rose slowly, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He grabbed an oil lamp, its flame flickering nervously. The attic access was a pull-down ladder in the hallway. He stood beneath it, staring up at the closed hatch. He reached for the cord, his fingers trembling, and pulled. The ladder descended with a creak, stirring up a plume of dust that shimmered in the lamplight. The attic was a cavern of forgotten things, moth-eaten blankets, cracked wooden boxes, a child's rocking horse missing an eye. The metallic, herbal scent was stronger now, tinged with something else, something acrid and sharp. He moved cautiously, his gaze sweeping the cluttered space. There was nothing obvious out of place, no sign of what could have made the sound. Then, tucked away in a dusty corner, beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers that seemed to date back half a century, he saw it. It felt heavy in his hands, dense, as if filled with lead. He carried it back down to the living room, placing it on the sturdy oak table. There was no visible lock, no clasp. He pressed and prodded, then, almost by accident, his finger brushed a specific point on the lid, and it clicked open with a soft sigh. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling herbs, was a leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. The script was spidery, precise, and distinctly old-fashioned. He carefully lifted it out. Along with the journal, there was a tarnished silver locket and a single, dried flower, its petals a skeletal brown. Reid opened the journal to the first page. The date was almost 2 centuries old. The opening entry, written in that meticulous hand, sent a prickle of unease down his spine. The entries grew more erratic, the language more desperate. The cabin was old, yes. But a sudden gust of wind rattling a window was one thing. A hidden box, a cryptic journal hinting at an ancient pact, and sounds that defied all rational explanation. That was something else entirely. Reid closed the journal, his fingers lingering on the cold leather, a clammy film coating his skin. The cabin was old, yes. That was something else entirely. He had tried, truly, to rationalize it all away. The creaks were settling timbers. The whispers, just the wind sifting through dry leaves outside, finding its way through every crack and knot in the aging wood. The faint, earthy smell? Old house, damp soil. But the next few days stripped away his defenses, one nerve-fraying incident at a time. He'd attributed it to the cabin's ancient pipes, perhaps the wind howling through a loose chimney flue. By morning, a framed photograph of his distant relative, perched on the mantelpiece, had been turned face down. He'd righted it, a prickle of unease on his neck, telling himself he must have knocked it when he'd stretched in the dim light. But later, a heavy iron skillet, left cooling on the stovetop, had been nudged almost to the edge, a faint, metallic scrape marring the wooden surface underneath. He stood over it, hands clenching, the rationalizations crumbling like dry plaster. He hadn't touched it. No one else was here. The phenomena escalated. The sounds grew clearer, less ambiguous. One evening, as he sat reading by the sputtering light of an oil lamp, a distinct scratching began, slow and deliberate, from behind the wall directly beside him. It wasn't the frantic scurry of a mouse or the industrious gnawing of a beetle. This was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like someone dragging a blunt nail across rough plaster, back and forth, back and forth. He froze, book suspended, every muscle taut. He couldn't deny it any longer. The cabin wasn't just old, it was alive with something malevolent. He was not alone here. And whatever shared the space with him was not benign. It was playful in a terrifying way, testing his boundaries, making its presence known in ways that twisted his perception of reality. He woke each morning with a layer of grit coating his tongue, his muscles aching from tension. Reid knew he had to understand. The cabin held its secrets close, but the nearest town, a cluster of weathered buildings a long drive down a winding, unpaved road, might hold answers. He started at the small public library, a quiet room smelling of aged paper and dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. He sifted through local history books, old newspaper archives on microfiche, anything that mentioned the remote forest or the families who had once settled it. He found general information on the area's logging past, a few anecdotes about eccentric hermits, but nothing specific to the cabin or his distant relative beyond a mention in a property transfer record from decades ago. The ancient pact and burial ground remained elusive. After days of fruitless searching, a librarian, a woman with kind eyes behind thick spectacles, suggested he try the old weather station outside of town. "It's mostly defunct now," she explained, but the former director, a retired local historian, kept a lot of the older records there, even some personal notes on local legends. He was quite the collector of obscure lore. The weather station was a squat, concrete building, its paint peeling in long strips, perched on a low hill overlooking a valley choked with trees. A rusted wind vane still clung precariously to the roof. The retired historian, a man named Bartholomew, sat hunched over a cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers and archaic scientific instruments. He was initially wary, his eyes sharp and suspicious, but Reid's earnest inquiries about the cabin, the land, and the unusual occurrences seemed to pique his interest, or perhaps, his pity. Bartholomew, after much prodding and the promise of strong coffee, produced a series of handwritten ledgers and brittle maps. One map, incredibly old, showed the precise location of Reid's cabin, marked with a faded, almost illegible symbol that looked like a crude, inverted triangle. Different. Older. Some families, they talked about pacts made with the land itself, for prosperity. Always a price, though. Reid's gaze was fixed on a series of archived newspaper clippings Bartholomew then laid out. One, from nearly a century ago, detailed the inexplicable disappearance of a small family who lived deep in the forest. The journal, the strange sounds, the movements in the cabin, they weren't isolated incidents. They were echoes, ripples from a history far more sinister than he could have imagined. His distant relatives' cryptic warnings, the pact, the sacrifice, it was all beginning to coalesce into a horrifying picture. He was not just an inheritor of a cabin, he was an inheritor of a legacy, a terrifying, malevolent debt that was now coming due. The cabin wasn't just manifesting phenomena, it was reminding him of what it truly was. And what it wanted. Reid stood in the frigid air, the memory of the weather station's oppressive chill still clinging to his skin. The journal, the strange sounds, the unsettling movements within the cabin, they were not disparate events. They were threads, weaving a tapestry of a history far more sinister than he had allowed himself to imagine. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, had seeped into his bones, confirming what his instincts had screamed. The cabin was a nexus, and the weather station, a waypoint to its dark heart. The thought was a lead weight in his stomach, but a stubborn resolve hardened his jaw. Fear was a bitter taste, but ignorance, he now realized, was a far more dangerous poison. He packed a stronger lantern, a thermos of scalding coffee, and a length of rope, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. The sun had already begun its descent, painting the western sky in bruised purples and oranges, a fitting backdrop for the journey he was about to undertake. The forest, usually a symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, felt muted, holding its breath. The path, once merely overgrown, now felt like a winding artery leading deeper into an unknown, diseased organ. When the skeletal silhouette of the weather station finally emerged through the twilight gloom, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The structure, a decaying sentinel, stood hunched and broken, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the encroaching night. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with dust and the pervasive scent of mildew and something else, a faint, acrid tang that made his nose wrinkle. His gaze immediately went to the corner where he'd found the fragmented journal. He knelt, running his gloved hand over the rough floorboards. They felt solid, unyielding. But there was a faint seam, almost imperceptible, where two planks met, slightly wider than the others. He pressed, heaved, then tried again, his fingers probing the gap. With a soft click, a section of the floor, perhaps 2 feet square, gave way, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. It wasn't locked, merely sealed shut with a thick layer of hardened grime. He pried it open, his breath catching in his throat. Within, wrapped in oilcloth, was not just one journal, but a stack of them, bound in worn leather, their pages yellowed and brittle. They were dated, spanning generations, each inscribed with the same meticulous, looping hand, though the ink faded with time. This was it. The missing pieces. He pulled the topmost journal, its cover embossed with a faded, unidentifiable symbol, and carried it closer to the lantern's glow. The first entries were mundane, observations of weather patterns, notes on forest growth. But then, the tone shifted. "The land demands its due," an entry from 1887 read. "The blight spreads from the ancient ground, seeping into the roots, into the very stones of the cabin. The harvests fail. The livestock sicken. The children." He flipped pages, his fingers trembling. Another entry, decades later, from a different hand, yet the same familiar script, the pact. It was made by the first settler, our ancestor, to appease the thing beneath the earth. A promise of sustenance, a tether to this place, so long as the bloodline endures. A terrible exchange for peace. He swallowed, a dry, rasping sound in the echoing space. A pact. His lineage. The words swam before his eyes, blurring, then sharpening into stark, terrifying clarity. "It is not enough to live here," a later entry stated, dated 1942, the paper thin and fragile. "The entity requires more. A stewardship, yes, but also a feeding. It grows restless. The land itself stirs, groaning beneath the weight of its ancient hunger. We thought to bind it, to contain it within the boundaries of the property. But it is the land itself. It is the earth, the trees, the very air. The entity wasn't in the cabin, it was the land. It wasn't a ghost haunting a structure, it was an ancient, malevolent force tied to the very ground beneath his feet, a force his ancestors had somehow attempted to placate, to control. And the pact. It demanded something from the bloodline. His own bloodline. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the far wall, not the settling of old wood, but a sound like something snapping under immense pressure. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost palpable pressure, pushing in on him from all sides. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone since he first set foot on this forgotten plot of earth. The journal entries weren't just history, they were a warning, a desperate plea from the dead. And now, he understood. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a burden, a cursed legacy that had finally come due. He was bound to this land, to this entity, just as his ancestors had been. The true horror wasn't just the cabin, but the inescapable, ancient hunger of the earth itself. The cabin breathed. Reid felt it in the floorboards that groaned beneath his weight, in the faint, metallic scent that now permeated the air, thick and cloying like old blood. The realization from the previous night, that the entity wasn't a haunting within the structure but the malevolent spirit of the land itself, had settled into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. It meant there was no escaping its gaze simply by stepping outside, The forest was its skin, the cabin its beating heart. He was utterly, completely within its grasp. He tried to shake off the creeping dread, to find some logical explanation for the cabin's growing strangeness. Perhaps the isolation was getting to him. But the evidence was too insistent, too personal. A mug he'd left on the kitchen table had moved to the windowsill. A book he'd been reading lay open on a different page than he remembered, its spine cracked in a new place. Small, insignificant shifts, yet they chipped away at the foundation of his sanity, making him question his own memory, his own perception. The air grew heavier, pressing in. The floorboards above creaked when no one was there. He found himself constantly turning, scanning the empty space behind him, his muscles tensed, waiting for a manifestation that never quite solidified, only hinted at its presence. He needed to communicate. He tried the old, dusty radio he'd found in the storage room, just static, a hiss like 1,000 tiny serpents. The cabin was a cage, silencing him. He remembered a crude map he'd seen in the relatives' effects, marking an old weather station a few miles deeper into the forest. It was a long shot, but perhaps an older, more robust communication system might be there, or at least a clearer line of sight for a signal. It was a desperate gamble, but remaining in the cabin felt like waiting for a predator to decide when to strike. The forest outside was no less menacing. The familiar path he'd taken countless times seemed to twist and narrow, trees leaning in like skeletal guardians. He kept checking his compass, but the needle spun erratically, refusing to settle, mirroring the disarray in his own mind. His breath hitched, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from exertion but from a primal fear that tightened his chest. There it stood, a dilapidated, rusting metal shack, its antenna mast bent and broken, a testament to years of neglect. The weather station. It was smaller than he'd imagined, more decrepit. The wind, which had been a low moan, picked up, whistling through the gaps in the corrugated metal, a mournful sound that seemed to carry ancient sorrow. He pushed open the creaking door. The interior was choked with dust and cobwebs, the air stale and heavy. Old, rusted equipment sat on a workbench, gauges, dials, a large, clunky radio unit. He approached it, hope flickering. He wiped away the grime, trying to make sense of the controls. No power. The wires were gnawed through, corroded. Another dead end. Then, something caught his eye. Tucked beneath a stack of decaying logbooks, half hidden by a fallen shelf, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, almost black with age. He picked it up, the leather cool and dry beneath his fingertips. It wasn't the official station log, this was personal. He flipped it open. The handwriting was spidery, faded ink on brittle pages. The entries weren't about weather patterns, but about the land, about it. The hunger grows. The earth demands its due. The old pact holds, but the terms shift. She will take what is owed, blood for peace, life for balance. The ritual must be maintained, or the forest will consume us all. Reid's eyes scanned further, his breath catching in his throat. Our line, bound by the ancient promise. The firstborn, a vessel. Each generation, a small offering to keep the larger beast at bay. But the last one, the relative, grew weak. Tried to defy it. Now it awakens fully. It seeks its true heir, its true vessel. The words seemed to burn off the page, not just revealing a horrifying truth, but confirming the entity's direct, personal interest in him. He wasn't just an unfortunate inheritor, he was the target, the next sacrifice in a lineage of blood and binding. The relative's death wasn't mysterious, it was a consequence of breaking the pact, and now Reid was next in line. The whistling wind outside intensified, becoming a shriek, rattling the loose metal sheets until the whole structure vibrated. It was immense, ancient, and furious. The words in the journal blurred, the ink seeming to writhe, as if the entity itself was flowing through the page, directly into his mind. He dropped the journal, scrambling back, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The walls of the weather station seemed to warp, the metal bending inward, groaning in protest. He choked, clawing at his throat, his vision blurring at the edges. He could feel its gaze, 1,000 unseen eyes watching his every move. Back in the cabin, the sense of being watched was suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with the entity's renewed presence. Every creak of the floor, every rustle outside the window, was a direct communication, a warning. The cabin wasn't just a house built on an ancient burial ground, it was the nexus of the pact, a living trap. He was the bait, the intended offering. He was Reid, and the land was hungry for him. Escape was not an option, the forest had closed its doors. The words still shimmered at the edges of Reid's vision, phantom embers that scorched the inside of his skull. Target. Sacrifice. He wasn't just an inheritor, he was the next offering, designated before his birth. He wouldn't be a lamb led to slaughter. Not him. Not Reid. He shoved the ancient journal back into its hiding place, his movements jerky, fueled by a frantic adrenaline. Escape. That was the only option. The cabin, with its creaking timbers and whispering shadows, was a cage. His phone, he knew, was useless, a dead weight since the first night. But there had to be something. A town, a road, another human soul. He grabbed his worn backpack, stuffing it with a few essentials, a water bottle, some stale energy bars, a small flashlight whose beam already seemed weak against the encroaching gloom of the room. He felt eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pervasive awareness that seeped from the very walls, the floorboards, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of weak light. Slinging the pack over his shoulder, he flung open the cabin door. The forest greeted him, not with the expected rush of fresh air, but with a heavy, still quiet that pressed in, almost suffocating. He stepped out, not bothering to close the door behind him. He struck out, not towards the winding, overgrown path he'd originally taken, but in a direction he hoped would lead him to higher ground, a place where he might catch a signal or at least see beyond the suffocating canopy. He pushed through thickets of thorny bushes, ignoring the way they snagged at his clothes and clawed at his skin. The ground was uneven, roots like grasping fingers reaching out to trip him. The trees grew denser with every step, their branches interlocked like skeletal arms, blocking out the sky. The light, already fading towards evening, became a mere memory. He pulled out the flashlight, its beam a paltry circle in the vast, deepening dimness. The forest floor was no longer familiar. Every snapped twig behind him made him whip around, heart hammering, but there was never anything there. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was moving, but felt no closer to escaping. It was like running on a treadmill, the scenery unchanging, the effort immense, the progress non-existent. Desperation gnawed at him. He needed a beacon, a fixed point. Then he remembered the old weather station. But it was a structure, a man-made landmark. It might have a radio, an old landline, anything. Or at the very least, it was a direction, a tangible goal in this swirling, green labyrinth. He altered his course, consulting his internal compass, trying to recall the map's orientation. The forest seemed to resist him. Vines, thick as ropes, appeared to drop from nowhere, tripping him. Branches, previously out of reach, suddenly snagged his hair and clothes. The ground beneath his feet turned spongy, then rocky, then back to soft earth, defying any consistent terrain. It was as if the very ground was shifting, refusing him passage. A faint, metallic glint caught his eye through the gloom. Hope surged, a desperate, fragile thing. He stumbled forward, bursting into a small clearing. There it was, the weather station. A squat, boxy building of corrugated metal, painted a faded, peeling white, now streaked with rust and green moss. A tall, skeletal antenna, bent and broken, clawed at the sky. It was utterly derelict, far more so than he'd imagined. He rushed towards it, his boots crunching on brittle leaves and scattered debris. The door, hanging precariously from one hinge, groaned open at his touch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light filtering through a grimy window. His eyes swept frantically over the interior. A rusted console, its dial shattered, sat against one wall. Wires dangled like dead vines. A single, ancient radio receiver, its casing cracked, lay on a rickety table, clearly beyond repair. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could connect him to the outside world. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, quickly choked back by a wave of crushing despair. This was it. This was his escape. A monument to futility. His gaze fell upon a section of the metal wall, near what might have once been a weather monitor. Scratched deeply into the flaking paint, as if with a sharp, heavy tool, was a crude symbol. It wasn't a casual graffiti mark. It was an intricate, disturbing design he recognized from the journal's margin illustrations, a swirling vortex with three radiating lines, ending in what looked like stylized, grasping hands. It was the mark of the entity. It wasn't just the cabin. It wasn't just the forest. Its reach was absolute, its power pervasive. This place, miles from the cabin, was just another extension of its domain. The entity knew he was trying to escape. It had let him come this far, only to mock him with the illusion of hope. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. He was trapped. Utterly, irrevocably trapped. Target. A cold dread, unlike anything he had felt before, had solidified into a knot of defiant resolve. He wouldn't simply wait for the blade. He would understand the hand that wielded it. He'd found the crude, hand-drawn map tucked inside a brittle, leather-bound journal left behind by his distant relative. A single, looping arrow pointed northeast, away from the cabin, towards a cluster of peaks. Scrawled beneath it, in shaky script, were the words, "The True Record." The Eye of the Forest. Reid knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was where he would find his answers. The journey was a brutal ascent. The forest, once merely dense, became a tangled, unforgiving maze of ancient, grasping branches. Hours later, he crested a ridge, the wind whipping his hair into his eyes, and there it was, the weather station. It stood stark against the bruised sky, a skeletal structure of rusted steel and peeling paint, perched precariously on a rocky outcrop. A collection of corroded instruments, anemometers, wind vanes, a rain gauge, jutted out like broken limbs, groaning faintly in the relentless wind. The main building, a small, square hut, looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its single window a vacant, dust-filmed eye. Reid pushed open the protesting metal door. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew, old paper, and something indescribably ancient, like forgotten soil and calcified bone. The room was cramped, dominated by a large, scarred wooden table littered with yellowed charts and logbooks. A single, rickety chair sat before it. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with more journals, peculiar instruments, and what looked like geological samples. His relative had been collecting, observing, meticulously recording. Reid's gaze snagged on a thick, leather-bound tome, distinct from the others. It was larger, its cover embossed with a symbol he recognized from the cabin's shifting patterns, a twisted knot of interlocking lines, like roots intertwined with a coiled serpent. As he pulled it free, a small, wooden box, hidden beneath it, slid forward. It was simple, unadorned, secured with a rusted iron clasp. His hands trembled slightly as he unlatched it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, tarnished silver amulet, identical to the one he'd found in the cabin, only this one was whole, not broken. He unrolled the parchment carefully. The script was archaic, spidery, and at first, almost illegible. But as he focused, the words seemed to coalesce, burning themselves into his mind. It wasn't a language he knew, yet he understood. It was a compulsion, a direct transfer of knowledge. The text spoke of the land, not merely as earth and stone, but as a living, breathing entity. An ancient guardian, it called itself, not benevolent, not malevolent, but simply demanding. It existed to maintain the balance, to ensure the cycle of decay and renewal. His ancestors, desperate for prosperity, for fertile fields and abundant harvests in a time of famine, had trespassed on sacred ground. They had sought to bend the land to their will, to extract more than it was willing to give. The guardian, angered by their hubris, had risen. It had brought blight and ruin, until one ancestor, more desperate and cunning than the rest, had sought a bargain. Not a plea for mercy, but a pact. A blood price. The lineage shall offer itself, one life for generations of plenty. This wasn't a ghost, it was a primordial force, older than any human concept of good or evil. Its demands were not born of malice, but of an ancient, unforgiving contract. They were the guardian reaching out, asserting its claim, preparing the ground. Preparing him. The parchment detailed the specifics. The sacrifice wasn't merely a death. It was a ritualistic absorption, a complete surrender of essence, body, and spirit, meant to revitalize the guardian, to rebind it to the land, ensuring another cycle of peace. And the amulet? A key, a conduit, worn by each designated sacrifice to facilitate the transfer, to smooth the path of consumption. His relative hadn't broken his amulet by accident, he had shattered it in a desperate, futile act of defiance. A low hum began to vibrate through the wooden floor, a deep resonance that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath the weather station. The instruments outside began to spin wildly, despite the steady, unwavering gale. The dust motes and the light shafts swirled into miniature cyclones. He looked down at the parchment again, his eyes drawn to the final, horrifying sentence, scrawled in what appeared to be his distant relative's frantic hand, squeezed into the margin. It senses weakness. It knows its time is due. The next offering is already marked. Reid was the next offering. He was the marked. The guardian didn't want to kill him, it wanted to consume him, body and soul, to become part of the ancient earth, to fulfill a pact made generations before his birth. The realization slammed into him, a physical blow, stealing his breath. Reid's hands, raw and trembling, clutched the heavy, leather-bound journal he'd salvaged from the abandoned weather station. He was the next offering. He was the marked. He wasn't. He swallowed hard, the taste of rust and old paper bitter on his tongue. The journal, stained and brittle, had laid bare the horrifying truth. The pact wasn't just a promise of land for protection, it was a cyclical offering, a feeding. Each generation, one was chosen, their essence drawn into the very soil, empowering the entity, binding it deeper to this place. His distant relative, the one who had owned the cabin, had tried to find a way out, had compiled these notes, these cryptic symbols and desperate pleas, before succumbing. The entries detailing a counter-ritual, a way to sever the connection, were fragmented, almost deliberately obscured, but Reid had pieced them together, fueled by a grim, desperate resolve. No, not quiet. It was listening. The path beneath his boots felt less like solid ground and more like a membrane stretched taut over an unseen void. He could feel the entity now, not just as a presence, but as a pressure, a vast, hungry awareness radiating from the cabin's dark core. It knew he was coming. It knew his intent. The cabin loomed, a skeletal sentinel against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows, like vacant eyes, seemed to watch his every step. The front door, which he'd left ajar in his frantic escape, was now shut, sealed by an unseen force. He didn't bother with the handle. Inside, the horror had coalesced. The familiar scent of pine and old wood was choked by the pervasive stench of decay and something acrid, like ozone. The floorboards groaned not under his weight, but as if the house itself was sighing, a long, drawn-out exhalation. A low hum vibrated through the very foundation, a sound that resonated deep in his bones, making his teeth ache. He moved to the center of the main room, where the journal indicated the ritual must be performed. He pulled a small, tarnished silver bowl and a handful of dried herbs from his bag, items painstakingly described in his relative's notes. He placed them on the rough-hewn floorboards, along with a small, sharp knife. His hands shook, but his focus was absolute. As he knelt, the hum intensified, vibrating the very air. He refused to look directly at them. He remembered the journal's warning, do not acknowledge its illusions. He began to chant, his voice hoarse, the ancient words feeling alien and powerful on his tongue. They were not words of supplication, but of severance. As the first syllable left his lips, a blast of cold air slammed into him, almost extinguishing the small candle he had lit. The hum spiked, becoming a high-pitched whine that clawed at his eardrums. You are the final thread. Reid ignored it, his gaze fixed on the symbols. He sprinkled the dried herbs into the silver bowl, their earthy scent instantly overwhelmed by the metallic tang in the air. He made a small incision on his palm with the knife, a sharp sting. This was the key, the journal had stated, the sacrifice not of a life, but of a connection. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore through the fabric of reality, shaking the cabin to its foundations. It was trying to break him, to make him falter. But he would not. He lifted the bowl, the mixture sloshing ominously, and began to pour it slowly around the perimeter of the room, tracing the ancient, protective symbols he had drawn. The entity raged, its presence a suffocating weight, trying to force him to his knees. The floorboards buckled, splintered. A beam overhead cracked with a sound like a gunshot. "The lineage ends with you," the voices screamed in his mind, now filled with a raw, primal fury. "We consume. We endure." Reid finished the circle, the last drops of the blood-herb mixture forming a complete barrier. The hum didn't cease, but it shifted, became agitated, trapped. They recoiled, pressing against the invisible boundary he had created, their formless shapes flickering with impotent rage. He had bought himself time. He had performed the ritual. But the entity was still there, vast and ancient, its hunger undiminished, merely contained. He had severed the direct connection, yes, but the pact was deep, woven into the very earth. The true horror wasn't just the entity's power, but the realization that his relative's journal had been incomplete. This wasn't the end. This was merely the first move in a game he still didn't fully understand, a game where the stakes were his very soul, and the cabin was merely a cage for something far more ancient and terrible than he could have ever imagined. The low, guttural growl that now emanated from beneath the floorboards was his only answer. The last drops of the blood-herb mixture clung to Reid's fingertips, slick and warm, before falling to complete the intricate circle. He swayed, the forest floor seeming to tilt beneath him, his muscles screaming with a profound, bone-deep fatigue. The hum that had vibrated through the cabin for days didn't cease, but it changed. It tightened, a strangled thrumming that felt less like a predatory drone and more like a trapped beast, its fury now concentrated, contained. The shadows, which had writhed like drowning things, still flickered at the periphery of his vision, but they no longer reached, no longer clawed. They simply pulsed, a dark, agitated breath held captive within the barrier he had painstakingly, desperately, drawn. He sank to his knees, the rough planks of the floor digging into his skin, but he barely registered the discomfort. His head spun, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes, a counterpoint to the sharp sting of the cuts on his forearms. Different. Not light, not clean, but heavy with a different kind of stillness, a breathless quiet that was more unsettling than the entity's previous assaults. It was the quiet of a cage, not an empty room. Reid pushed himself up, every movement a monumental effort. He stumbled toward the door, his gaze snagging on the circle. It glowed faintly, a dull, crimson line against the aged wood, a stark boundary. He had done it. He had trapped it. No birds sang. The leaves hung motionless on the branches, as if the very trees held their breath, listening. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer hung in the air directly above its roof, a distortion in the clear afternoon light, like heat haze on a summer road. He walked, putting one foot in front of the other, the forest floor a blur beneath his worn boots. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing him down, but a restless energy pulsed beneath his skin, a nervous tremor that wouldn't settle. His mind, fogged with fatigue and the lingering psychic residue of the confrontation, latched onto a destination, the old weather station. It was a utilitarian structure, perched on a small rise a few miles deeper into the forest, a relic from a time when the area had been surveyed more frequently. It offered a clear view, a vantage point. He needed to see the cabin from afar, to confirm its new, terrible stillness. The trek was a blur of aching muscles and shallow breaths. The path, overgrown and barely visible, seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, he saw it, the weather station, a small, square building of weathered gray wood, its rusted antenna reaching like a skeletal finger into the sky. He moved to the largest window, its glass opaque with years of grime, and scraped a clear patch with his sleeve. He peered out, across the expanse of trees, searching the cabin. He reached up, his fingers brushing against his temple, and found a subtle, raised scar that hadn't been there before. It was faint, almost imperceptible, tracing a delicate line just above his left eyebrow, like a brand. The blood. The pact. He had given more than just his blood to complete the circle. He had given a piece of himself, a fragment of his own lineage, a vital connection to the very history that had bound the entity to his family. He felt it now, a profound sense of severance. He had cut himself off, not just from the entity's direct influence, but from the very roots that had anchored him to the cabin's cursed legacy. He was free, perhaps, but untethered, adrift. And then, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible thrumming, not in the air, not from the distant cabin, but deep within his own bones. A low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from his very core. The entity was trapped, yes. But the horror wasn't gone. It had merely changed its vessel. The cabin was quiet, but Reid was not. He was the new, unwilling host to a horror that transcended time, a hum that would never truly cease. The hum that had vibrated through the cabin for days, a low, guttural thrum that had become the very pulse of his existence, shuddered. It didn't fade, it snapped. The abrupt cessation left a vacuum in the air, a deafening absence that pressed against his eardrums. He felt lightheaded, as if the air itself had thinned, scrubbed clean of sound, leaving an ache in his chest. He collapsed, not onto the cold, damp earth, but onto something less tangible. The ground beneath him felt momentarily soft, yielding, then solidified into the familiar, packed soil. His head lolled back, eyes staring up at the splintered rafters of the cabin, now merely wood and shadow, devoid of the oppressive weight that had clung to them for so long. The flickering lantern, almost out of oil, cast long, wavering fingers of light that danced across the walls, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. Just the quiet decay of an abandoned structure. A profound emptiness settled in, deeper than the physical exhaustion. The horror was gone, or at least, its immediate presence had receded. But it hadn't vanished. It had merely been fed. The pact, broken and then renewed, had taken its due. He felt like a vessel scoured clean, but with the faint, indelible scent of its previous contents still clinging to its interior. His throat was raw, his body a symphony of aches and tremors. He pushed himself up, every joint protesting, his vision blurring at the edges. The cabin, once a suffocating maw, now felt inert, a husk. He stumbled towards the door, not looking back at the intricate, now inert, circle he had drawn. No unnatural glow emanated from the cabin's windows, no spectral mists coiled around its foundation. But Reid knew better. He knew the quiet, hungry patience that now resided within its walls, sated for a time, but never truly gone. It would wait. It would always wait. He began to walk, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to put distance between himself and that place. His legs were numb, his feet heavy, but a desperate need to escape propelled him forward. The trees stood sentinel, their branches skeletal against the sky, no longer twisting into suggestive shapes. Yet, he felt their gaze, 1,000 silent witnesses to his ordeal. Hours passed. He walked until his vision swam, until his muscles seized with cramps, until the first gray streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky. He stumbled out of the dense woods, breaking through a final thicket of brambles, and found himself on a narrow, overgrown track. Ahead, barely visible through the morning mist, stood a structure of corrugated metal and a skeletal antenna. The weather station. It was a desolate sight, rust-streaked and abandoned, a testament to civilization's retreat from this forgotten corner of the world. A single, small window was boarded up, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The wind whistled faintly through gaps in the metal siding. He dragged himself towards it, driven by a primal need for connection, for proof that the world beyond the cabin still existed. He pushed open a flimsy, unlatched door. A rickety table stood in the center, littered with outdated charts and a rusted, ancient radio set. The power was out, of course. Everything was dead. But on the table, amidst the detritus, lay a small, satellite phone, its battery indicator a single, defiant green bar. Someone had been here recently. Someone had left it. A gift? A forgotten tool? Or a final, cruel joke? His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The smooth plastic felt alien in his grip, a symbol of a world he barely remembered. He pressed the power button, the small screen flickering to life. No signal. He sighed, a shuddering breath that felt like it came from the depths of his bones. He knew this feeling. The forest, the cabin, they didn't want him to leave so easily. He walked outside, holding the phone aloft, scanning the horizon as if seeking an invisible beacon. He climbed onto the rusted platform beneath the antenna, the metal groaning under his weight. And there, as the sun finally broke through the mist, a single bar appeared on the phone screen. One bar. Enough. He called the first number that came to mind, a distant colleague he hadn't spoken to in years. The voice that answered was groggy, confused, but undeniably human. Reid spoke, his voice hoarse, fragmented, telling a story that even to his own ears sounded like a fever dream. He omitted the rituals, the pacts, the entity. He spoke of disorientation, of an accident, of being lost in the woods. The colleague, blessedly, didn't ask too many questions, just promised to contact the local authorities, to send someone. As he ended the call, the phone's battery died, the screen going black. He stood there, high above the forest floor, the wind whipping at his tattered clothes. He was safe. He was alive. The horror had been contained, for now. The silence was no longer empty, it was pregnant with possibility, with the promise of return. He had paid the price, an ancient debt settled, but the payment had altered him. He was a survivor, yes, but also a custodian of a terrible secret, a keeper of the lineage. They merely learned to wait in the light.